endureth all things, 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 endureth all things. Love hopeth all things, endureth all things. The contradictions of experience confuse, confound. Tides of beauty caught in an undertow of slime, goodness, luminous, refined, manacled by evil no hand can stay, love, ripe and full, stalked by hate that binds and chokes, hope leaping clear from peak to peak, haunted by echoes of despair. The contradictions of experience confuse, confound. Which is the true, the sure, the real? The final vote of man's spirit, for what is it cast? Is there eternal drama here, endless in interval, whole in itself? Is the tension only shadow, a trick of mind, a whimper in the heart and nothing more? The closing vote, what does it say? The contradictions are final? Never. The growing edge of hope remains when all the voices of despair are still. Love persists when hate no longer holds. Goodness triumphs, though evil struggles to the end. All this man's spirit says. The dogmas of the mind are afterthoughts. So let the winds blow, let the torrents fume, let the night wax in darkness, let death be death. Life will not die, life holds and grows.
The audio you just listened to is Howard Thurman's own voice, recorded in 1970. The Thurman Digital Library at Pitt Theological Library at Candler at Emory University is one of the fabulous online resources on Thurman where you can find stuff like this. And this recording comes directly from the book The Inward Journey, originally published in 1961. Like many of you, I'm kind of a bookish guy, and I read broadly in theology, philosophy, spirituality, arts, literature, and when I encounter a difficult book, I will struggle to get into it until I can hear the author's voice speaking to me. As I read, I listen to hear the timbre of their voice, their hopes and their fears, and the things that keep them up at night, and the things that give them deep joy. I want you to hear Thurman's voice. And so that's why I started with this recording. Thurman is a deep guy. And this is what I would call a difficult read. I've read Thurman before, fruitfully, and it was part of my interest in reading this. But what I encountered here is deep waters. I felt the same way about this text as I did when I first read Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation 20 years ago. And as I sat down to read this book, I envisioned myself breezing through the 150 odd pages and on to supplementary material. But instead, I read a page, and then I reread the page, and then I reread the page, and I sat with it. This is not your typical monograph with a beginning, a middle, and conclusion. Thurman wrote these reflections while he was the dean of Marsh Chapel at Boston College. Only the third person of color to have a similar position in the U.S. While there is some internal organization, such as the exploration of scriptural passages, the nature of a weekly bulletin is somewhat occasional. But each entry in this book, which are only about a page or a page and a half long, can be read fruitfully as a prompt for meditation on their own, irrespective of the larger context of the book. Thurman is a spiritual teacher that is worth attending to. Daniel Wolpert, who considers Thurman one of his own spiritual teachers, had this to say.
The thing about a spiritual teacher, you see, is that we say that somebody who is engaged in a reflection and discussion and a transmission of spirituality, that what is happening when you encounter this person is you're not just taking in information, but you are really encountering a mind that is more realized. Right? Like this person has had insights, experiences, reflections. They, as a human being, are becoming more fully what all of us are called to be. Right? This much more open, compassionate, connected person. They've had some insights.
And so here we are. In this book, I encountered the more realized mind of Howard Thurman. I want to take you a little ways on the inward journey. But before we get there, let's take a few minutes to consider Howard Thurman's outward journey and the aspects of his life that brought him to the place where he could reflect from such a deep place. Howard Thurman was born in 1899, 2 generations out of slavery, likely in West Palm Beach, but he grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida, where he attended Mount Bethel Baptist Church as a kid. A precocious and studious youngster in a time when there was no 7th grade available for black school children, Thurman studied with his elementary school principal in order to pass the 8th grade exam, and he entered Florida Baptist Academy. He went on to study at Morehouse College, where his slowness of speech and long, gangly arms earned him the nickname Dud. He went on from Morehouse to Rochester, distinguishing himself everywhere he went. He was always the valedictorian, always the smartest person in the room. When Thurman is at Rochester, he has a meeting with one of his mentors, George Cross, who was at the time a expert in Schleiermacher and one of Thurman's intellectual mentors. And George Cross encourages Thurman to not write from his perspective of being an African American and the context of his people, but to write about the timeless truths George Cross dies very suddenly in 1929, and he doesn't live to see just how spectacularly that Thurman would go on to ignore his advice. But it is a way that Thurman's intellectual formation kind of ran against his experience as an African American. Thurman goes on to be ordained a Baptist minister in 1925. He's working and publishing about racism, and he pastors a church in Ohio before returning to Morehouse College to be on faculty there for a time. During this period, he also comes into contact with the work of Quaker theologian and philosopher Rufus Jones, who introduces Thurman to Quaker mysticism, and that becomes an influence on how he perceives spiritual things. From 1932 to 1944, Thurman is the dean of Rankin Chapel at Howard University in D.C., and it is during this time that he takes part in a fairly formative experience for him. He heads a 4-person delegation, a Negro delegation, to Burma, Ceylon, and India, and there he meets Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi is transfixed by this man who is a member of an oppressed group, but is part of the religion of his oppressors, Christianity. And his conversation with Thurman bears fruit, and Thurman will bring back some of Gandhi's thinking on nonviolence, and around this time he begins to write and speak often about how Jesus is on the side of the downtrodden and the disinherited. His thinking on this would culminate in his 1949 publication of his most famous work, Jesus and the Disinherited. My own journey with Thurman began with the book Jesus the Disinherited. In my 20s, I participated in a program called Mission Year, which was a year-long mission. We lived in intentional community in a under-resourced African-American neighborhood in Atlanta, and tried to love our neighbors. And in that context, we went to a African-American church, and we got connected with the neighborhood, and we tried to listen well and to love our neighbors. And part of listening well, we read Thurman and tried to get a sense of the gospel for our neighbors. That Thurman was not writing to us, he was writing to the African American community and to other dispossessed people, and bringing the truth of Jesus' spirituality alive in that context. Thurman left Howard University in 1944 to help plant the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples with Alfred Frisk, a Presbyterian pastor. It was the first intentionally racially diverse congregation planted in the country. In 1953 to 1965, where he writes The Inward Journey, he is the dean of Marsh Chapel, and there he also presses into this idea of the beloved community. It was a Methodist university, but Thurman was not a Methodist. This was a community for all peoples at a Methodist university. In this brief overview of major events in Thurman's life, I hope you hear many of these aspects that are pieces, that are various strands formational to his identity. One piece that I only mentioned opaquely, but was his family heritage. His grandmother, Nancy Ambrose, was a slave, and her experience of slavery and her spirituality had a deep impact on Thurman. He avoided Pauline texts by the Apostle Paul or attributed to the Apostle Paul because of the way his grandmother had heard those texts preached against her in time of slavery, and he began to favor the spirituality of Jesus, which he saw as coming from the margins, whereas Paul was a Pharisee and he was the spirituality of the center. Now, he doesn't do this uniformly. In fact, it's interesting, two of the sections of this book, the Inward Journey, are essentially a poetic lexio of 1 Corinthians 13, which is Pauline, and Psalm 139, which is attributed to King David, and those would kind of both be spirituality from the center. But Thurman will interact with these in a magnanimous way, and he didn't have a problem with either text. It just noticing where things are coming from. The Black Church deeply impacted his experience. His whole African American identity is part of who Thurman was in the world, and he would not trade that to be some sort of vague teacher of timeless truths, but he spoke to a particular people and from a particular context. His education was formational to who he was. He was, in terms of his theological and philosophical learnings, he was a modernist. He didn't talk often about the supernatural when he read scripture, but would talk about what this miraculous thing meant. But he was also a mystic, and part of that mysticism he pulls up from his own heritage, and part of it is his interaction with Quakerism, and then he is shaped by his interfaith dialogue with folks like Gandhi, and his desire just to see a community of reconciliation where people come together from all backgrounds and meet as sisters and brothers. One of my guides in understanding Howard Thurman is Barbara Holmes, who in Joy Unspeakable quotes Thurman as saying, "There is in every person an inward sea, and in the sea is an island, and on that island there is an altar, and standing guard before that altar is the angel with the flaming sword. Nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon the altar unless it has the mark of your inner authority. Nothing passes unless it is part of the fluid area of your consent. This is your crucial link with the eternal." Holmes, reflecting on Thurman's metaphor of his mystical journey inward, identifies 3 parts of the journey. First, the human spirit must connect to the eternal by turning towards God's immanence and effability and yearning. Second, each person must explore the inner reality of his or her humanity, facing unmet potential and catastrophic failure with unmitigated honesty and grace. Finally, each of us must face the unlovable neighbor, the enemy outside of our embrace, and the shadow skulking in the recesses of our own heart. Only then can we declare God's perplexing and unlikely peace on earth. These tasks require a knowledge of self and others that only comes from the centering down that Thurman advocates. By now it should be evident that Howard Thurman was a unique and incredible person. He had quite an outward journey, and he had a depth of an inward journey. He was a spiritual teacher in that he was, as Dan said for us, a mind more realized than our own, and he has a lot to teach us. And I have endeavored in this project to listen to Thurman's life, and by listening to his life and insights, it opens up the wisdom that he has to share for us. I don't want to try to synthesize the book and tell you everything that's in here. I don't think it is a very summarizable book. But I wanted to close by reading a section of this book. Howard Thurman, in his own words, "It will be my voice this time, but I trust that you, having spent some time with Thurman on this journey with me, will hear the voice of Howard Thurman." The setting is the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are at the central figures in this idyllic surrounding. All is peaceful, all is innocent. They are told by God that they are free to do anything except one thing. They are forbidden to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge that grows in the midst of the garden. For if they eat of the fruit, they shall be driven from the garden, and from that day forward, they shall be responsible for their own lives. They eat of the fruit. They are driven out of the garden. They become responsible for their own lives. With the coming of knowledge, they have lost their innocence. The transition from innocence to knowledge is always perilous and fraught with hazard. There is something very comfortable and reassuring about innocence. To dwell in innocence is to inhabit a region where storms do not come and where all the breezes are gentle and balmy. It is to live in the calm of the eye of the hurricane. It is to live in a static environment which makes upon the individual no demands other than to be. All else is cared for, is guaranteed. But when knowledge comes, the whole world is turned upside down. The meaning of things begins to emerge, and more importantly, the relations between things are seen for the first time. Questions are asked and answers are sought. A strange restlessness comes over the spirit, and the enormity of error moves over the horizon like a vast shadow. Struggle emerges as a way of life. An appetite is awakened that can never be satisfied. A person becomes conscious of himself. The urge to know, to understand, to find answers turns inward. Every estimate of others becomes a question of self-estimate. Every judgment upon life becomes a self-judgment. The question of the meaning of oneself becomes one with the meaning of life. This process of moving from innocence to knowledge is never finished. Always there is the realm of innocence. Always there is the realm of knowledge. Always there is some area of innocence untouched by knowledge. The more profound the growth of knowledge, the more aware the individual becomes of the dimensions of innocence. Pride in knowledge is always tempered by the dominion of innocence. Often, we do not become aware of innocence until we experience knowledge. The setting is the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are the central figures in an idyllic surrounding. All is peaceful. All is innocent. They are told by God that they are free to do anything except one thing. They are forbidden to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge which grows in the middle of the garden. For if they eat of the fruit, they shall be driven from the garden, and from that day forward they shall be responsible for their own lives. They eat of the fruit, they are driven out of the garden, and they become responsible for their own lives.